What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 14 fascinating things no one ever told you about John Wilkes Booth. When it comes to infamous assassins with 3 names that killed vastly influential historical figures, John Wilkes Booth is, at the very least, in the top 3. Like James Earl Ray and Lee Harvey Oswald, Booth shot his way into the history books by becoming the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln, one of America's most beloved presidents. Like the other previously mentioned killers, Booth has become a bit of a historical celebrity at the center of one of the most talked about events to ever occur in America. However, there is still a wealth of fascinating information about the man himself that few know. John Wilkes Booth lived an incredibly interesting life before, during, and after his assassination of Lincoln. From his family background to the machinations that led to his fateful decision, and including a large number of unlikely coincidences, the story of John Wilkes Booth is definitely one worth telling. John himself had a mildly successful acting career. While John Wilkes Booth's acting career never reached the heights of his more popular family members, he was still a very successful actor in his own right. He was good enough at it to make a permanent living doing it, which few could say at the time. He attracted some positive press attention, including a lot of notice when he reprised his father's famous role as Richard III. John worked as an actor his entire life, right up until his fateful assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln watched him star in a play years before the assassination. John Wilkes Booth was a mildly successful actor, but he was apparently notable enough to perform in front of some important audience members. Chief among these was the Commander-in-Chief, President Abraham Lincoln, who saw his future assassin perform in a play called The Marble Heart in Ford Theater, the very site of their later run-in. This early encounter also happened to occur a few days before Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, one of his most famous acts. His brother's mistress was on stage when John assassinated Lincoln. Surely, the Lincoln assassination was a memorable and traumatic moment for everyone who witnessed it. However, the incident may have been even more shocking for one particular person. Laura Keene was acting on stage when Lincoln was shot, and no doubt watched as his assassin leapt onto the stage and escaped. Keene was probably pretty surprised to see the brother of her secret lover, Edwin Booth, running away after murdering the president. It was likely the most memorable performance of her career, but not for a good reason. Booth starred in a production of Julius Caesar months before the assassination. History is rife with fantastic ironies, and this is one of the all-time great examples. A few months before John Wilkes Booth's infamous assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Booth and his brothers starred in a production of Julius Caesar. Not only is the play the inspiration for their father's terrific name, it also happens to be the story of an important world leader getting assassinated. Booth would even borrow a supposed quote from the real-life Brutus when killing the president Sic Semper Tyrannis. 1 year before the assassination, his brother Edwin saved Lincoln's son's life. Sometimes history seems way too coincidental to be real. In what appears to be a twisted case of karma gone wrong, it eventually came to light that the Lincolns and the Booths were linked before the fateful assassination. John Wilkes Booth's super-famous older brother Edwin just so happened to save the life of Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd, a year before John killed Abe. Robert Todd had almost fallen under a moving train, and Edwin pulled him back in the nick of time. He tried to kidnap Lincoln a month before the assassination. The personal links between Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth keep piling up. While their earlier run-ins were merely coincidence, at this point in their history, Booth started willfully trying to bring the two together. Before eventually deciding to murder the president, Booth first tried a less violent approach when he plotted to kidnap Lincoln instead. This plot occurred a month before the eventual assassination, but fizzled when Lincoln simply didn't show up where Booth thought he would. Booth moved on to Plan B. He belonged to a crazy right-wing political party. John Wilkes Booth wasn't just a lone wolf, as history sometimes portrays him. Booth was involved in wacko politics long before the decision to snuff out he of the stovepipe hat. Booth belonged to the Know Nothing Party, an extreme right-wing group that hated Lincoln and violently opposed immigration and integration. The party was so named because of its intense secrecy, as members were sworn to say they knew nothing if ever asked. It was through this organization that Booth began making the connections that would lead to his anti-Abe plotting. He had accomplices who were supposed to assassinate different politicians. History tends to portray the Lincoln assassination as a singular event, which really misses out on the scope of the whole thing. Lincoln was killed as part of a concerted effort to wipe out his entire political structure. Simultaneous strikes were planned for several other prominent politicians on the same night, although only one was actually carried out. General Ulysses Grant didn't attend the play as planned, whereas the would-be assassin of Vice President Andrew Johnson simply chickened out. Secretary of State William Seward was attacked in his home and stabbed in the neck, but was rescued by his son and survived. All of these would-be killers were accomplices of John Wilkes Booth. He broke his leg leaping to the stage after shooting Lincoln. Few talk about just how much of an action scene the assassination of Lincoln was. John Wilkes Booth burst into Lincoln's private balcony seat, plugged him in the back of the head, and then dramatically leaped down to the stage to make his escape. Since Booth was just an actor and not an actual character in a Hollywood movie, he of course broke his leg during the massive drop. He kept moving, however, fighting through the pain to successfully escape and go on the run. A doctor who treated the fugitive Booth was sentenced to life in prison. Due to the anti-Lincoln conspiracy he was a part of, John Wilkes Booth had some serious connections that helped him escape and stay on the run after his infamous slaying. One of these hookups found Booth a doctor, Samuel Mudd, who was willing to treat his badly broken leg. Mudd successfully treated the leg, and helped Booth evade justice for a little while longer, but he paid a heavy price for his treasonous actions. Mudd was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that was eventually commuted by a future president. A Confederate spy ring helped Booth stay on the run. John Wilkes Booth is often described as a sort of lone wolf, like Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly was, but the truth is that Booth was at the heart of a vast right-wing, Confederate-led conspiracy to oust Abraham Lincoln. This involvement, which included membership in the Know Nothing Party, helped Booth make some powerful connections, and that network leapt into action once Booth had successfully escaped the scene of his grisly crime. A Confederate spy ring helped Booth stay on the run despite an enormous manhunt for him, a feat he kept up for almost 2 weeks. The man who shot John Wilkes Booth was extremely insane. Even the people surrounding John Wilkes Booth in his worst moment were incredibly interesting. Chief among these is Boston Corbett, the man who shot and killed Booth. Corbett was part of a gigantic manhunt to find the president's killer, but unlike others, a monetary reward was not foremost in Corbett's mind. Corbett had some deeper motivations, including an insane obsession with religion that had seen him previously castrate himself. Some believe Corbett was suffering from mercury poisoning. It took John 3 hours for Booth to die after being shot. As in many good stories, the final chapter in John Wilkes Booth's tale really dragged on. After being shot by Boston Corbett, Booth was in agony but not yet dead. He was taken to a nearby house where medical aid was attempted but ultimately proved unsuccessful. Although some in the hunting party wanted Booth to live so he could stand trial, most were happy when he finally expired after 3 painful hours. When it comes to infamous assassins with triple-barreled names, John Wilkes Booth ranks among the top, alongside James Earl Ray and Lee Harvey Oswald. But while many people know Booth as the man who pulled the trigger that ended President Abraham Lincoln's life, far fewer understand the tangled web of strange coincidences, eerie parallels, theatrical drama, political extremism, and downright bizarre historical footnotes that defined Booth's life both before and after his final fatal act. John Wilkes Booth wasn't just a bitter Confederate sympathizer with a gun. He was a complex, charismatic, and deeply troubled man whose life intersected with history in fascinating, haunting, and often ironic ways that most people never learn about. For starters, long before he became an assassin, Booth had carved out a moderately successful acting career. While not as accomplished as his more famous brother Edwin Booth, one of the most renowned Shakespearean actors of the 19th century, John was still widely known in theatrical circles and was earning a living on stage, which in itself was no small feat. He made headlines reprising his father Junius Brutus Booth's iconic role as Richard III, and his performances were reviewed in newspapers, earning him a degree of celebrity. Even more ironic, though, is that President Abraham Lincoln himself had once been an audience member. That's right. Years before Booth would shoot Lincoln in Ford's Theater, the president had unknowingly watched his future killer perform in a play called The Marble Heart, in that very same theater. Even more eerie, this took place just days before Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address, one of the most defining speeches in American history. The convergence of these two historical figures, one on stage, the other in the audience, is almost too strange to believe, but it happened, and it foreshadowed the macabre performance that would follow years later. The Ford's Theater connection gets even weirder when you consider that Booth's brother's mistress, Laura Keene, was acting on stage the night of the assassination. Keene, a well-known actress in her own right, had a front-row seat, literally and figuratively, to the moment Booth leapt from the presidential box to the stage, shouting "Sic semper tyrannis," as he made his escape. That phrase, Latin for "thus always to tyrants," was reportedly also spoken by Brutus after assassinating Julius Caesar, and in a moment of almost theatrical self-parody, Booth had played in a Julius Caesar production with his brothers just a few months earlier. It's hard to overstate the irony. The assassin who fancied himself a modern-day Brutus had literally performed Julius Caesar on stage, borrowing both its plot and its line for the most dramatic moment of his life. But even more surreal is the fact that just a year before that fateful night, Booth's own brother, Edwin, had actually saved the life of Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln. While waiting for a train, Robert had lost his footing and nearly fell between the platform and a moving rail car. Edwin Booth grabbed him by the collar and yanked him to safety, an act of heroism the young Lincoln never forgot. So, in the grand cosmic scoreboard, the Booth family giveth, and the Booth family taketh away. The connections between Booth and Lincoln become even more complex when you learn that Booth didn't initially set out to murder the president. In fact, his first plan was to kidnap Lincoln. He and a group of co-conspirators hatched an elaborate scheme to abduct the president in March 1865, with the hope of using him as a bargaining chip to secure the release of Confederate prisoners. The plan fell apart when Lincoln changed his schedule at the last minute and failed to appear where Booth expected him. When the kidnapping plot failed, Booth pivoted to assassination, a horrifying plan B that he carried out with chilling precision. Booth's descent into extremism didn't happen overnight. He was a long-time member of the Know Nothing Party, an ultranationalist right-wing political organization known for its rabid anti-immigration stance and fierce opposition to the abolition of slavery. Named for their cultish vow of silence, members would claim they knew nothing when questioned. The party embodied the nativist rage and anti-Lincoln sentiments that fueled Booth's political radicalization. Through this party, Booth met like-minded fanatics and built the very network that would eventually support his plot to take out Lincoln and destabilize the Union government. Which brings us to another under-discussed element of the assassination. It wasn't just about killing one man. Booth and his co-conspirators planned to decapitate the entire Union leadership in one coordinated strike. While Booth handled Lincoln, accomplices were dispatched to eliminate Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. Seward was actually stabbed multiple times in his own home by Lewis Powell, but miraculously survived thanks to the intervention of his son. Meanwhile, George Atzerodt, assigned to kill Johnson, lost his nerve and never carried out the attack. General Ulysses S. Grant, another target, escaped only because he skipped the theater that night. Had Booth's plan succeeded in full, the government would have been thrown into chaos, and the fragile post-Civil War peace could have collapsed entirely. After shooting Lincoln, Booth made a daring leap from the presidential box to the stage, a scene worthy of any action movie, but broke his leg in the process. Still, he fled the scene in a blur of adrenaline, shouting his Latin slogan and limping into history. He was not alone in his escape. A complex Confederate spy ring formed during the war helped Booth evade capture, providing safe houses, food, and medical care. One of the key figures in this escape effort was Dr. Samuel Mudd, a Maryland physician who treated Booth's broken leg. Mudd didn't just treat Booth. He sheltered him and helped him continue his flight from justice. For this act of treasonous aid, Mudd was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence only commuted years later by President Andrew Johnson. Booth remained on the run for nearly 2 weeks, eluding one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. It was a Confederacy-funded network of sympathizers and loyalists who kept him moving, but the law finally caught up with him at a tobacco farm in Virginia. There, Union soldiers surrounded the barn where Booth and an accomplice were hiding. The officers wanted to take Booth alive, but one man had other plans: Sergeant Boston Corbett. Corbett was a deeply religious man whose extremism rivaled even Booth's, albeit in the opposite direction. Known for castrating himself to avoid sexual temptation and possibly suffering from mercury poisoning from his hat-making days, Corbett claimed he shot Booth to prevent further bloodshed. He fired without orders and killed Booth on the spot, or so it seemed. In truth, Booth didn't die instantly. He lingered in agony for 3 long hours, paralyzed and barely able to speak. As soldiers and civilians watched over him, Booth reportedly muttered, "Tell my mother I died for my country." His final words, according to some accounts, were "useless, useless," possibly in reference to his paralyzed hands or the failure of his broader plan. It was a tragic and ignoble end to a life that had once held promise but had been derailed by fanaticism and hate. And yet, Booth's death didn't end the story. In the years that followed, rumors swirled that the man shot in that barn wasn't really Booth. Conspiracy theories flourished, and for decades, various imposters claimed to be the real John Wilkes Booth. Even the body buried under Booth's name was called into question, with his family at one point requesting the corpse be exhumed for DNA testing, a request that was ultimately denied. The mystique surrounding Booth only grew with time, transforming him from mere assassin into a dark legend. He became the first in a grim line of American killers whose names would live on in infamy, not just for their crimes, but for the twisted logic, obsession, and strange coincidences that seemed to hover over their lives. But what makes John Wilkes Booth so endlessly fascinating isn't just that he killed a president. It's everything that surrounded it. The fact that he was a celebrated actor who had once performed in front of his victim, that his brother had saved that victim's son, that he tried kidnapping before resorting to murder, that he echoed the words and story of Brutus from Julius Caesar, a role he had literally played, that he was supported by a Confederate spy network, that he had co-conspirators targeting the entire Union government, that he was treated by a doctor who paid for it with a life sentence, that the man who shot him was a self-castrated zealot, and that he died slowly, whispering cryptic last words. In short, John Wilkes Booth wasn't just a man with a gun and a grudge. He was the living embodiment of a divided America. Handsome, talented, privileged, impassioned, extremist, and fatally disillusioned. His story is a mosaic of theatrical tragedy, political rage, and historical irony so thick you'd think it was fiction if it weren't so thoroughly documented. There are villains in history, and then there are those who leave behind a crater, whose actions ripple through time and whose lives seem stitched together by fate, absurdity, and darkness. John Wilkes Booth is one of them, and the more you learn about him, the more you realize that the assassination was just the climax of a story that was always strange from the start. As students, we spend so much time in school learning about the people who helped shape history that it's a real wonder we don't learn pretty much everything there is to know about them. Especially for figures like Abraham Lincoln, Cleopatra, and Neil Armstrong. But the honest truth is that there are still so many wild facts about important historical figures we can learn every day. And sometimes it's these previously unknown facts that blow our minds more than the ones we learned in our textbooks. Vote up the new facts we learned about historical figures in 2020 that you're most happy to have learned. Marcel Marceau helped Jewish children escape the Holocaust by miming. Marcel Marceau helped Jewish children escape the Holocaust by miming. Marcel Marceau was a world-renowned mime who dazzled audiences with his silence. He was recruited by his cousin to join the French resistance during World War II that had an operation to rescue Jewish children from German-occupied France by secretly bringing them to neutral countries. Marcel was perfect for the job as the kids really seemed to feel safe when they were with him. He would mime to keep them quiet while they were escaping. Nikola Tesla predicted smartphones with extreme accuracy nearly 100 years before their inception. In an interview with John B. Kennedy in 1926, Nikola Tesla said. When wireless is perfectly applied, the whole Earth will be converted into a huge brain, which in fact it is, all things being particles of a real and rhythmic whole. We shall be able to communicate with one another instantly, irrespective of distance. Not only this, but through television and telephony we shall see and hear one another as perfectly as though we were face to face, despite intervening distances of thousands of miles. And the instruments through which we shall be able to do his will be amazingly simple compared with our present telephone. A man will be able to carry one in his vest pocket.